we wanted to talk through the assumptions that we're going to use for a perfectly competitive model. Your textbook refers to these things as the perfect competition conditions in a market, but I'm going to refer to them as assumptions. We're basically talking about the same thing. We need to make sure we know what assumptions are. I'm going to go through the list and then circle back to that. So these are the 4 assumptions that I want to lay out about what a perfectly competitive market looks like. Number 1, that we've got a large number of buyers and sellers such that no one single buyer or no one single seller has an ability to influence market prices. Another way that this often gets referred to is the assumption on price takers. It's saying that both sides of the market, whether we're talking about the consumers, the buyers, or the sellers, the producers, both sides of the market, they have absolutely no ability to influence market prices. The way that I like to think about this is a big tug of war. If we've got a whole bunch of buyers on one side of the market and a whole bunch of sellers on the other side of the market, if any one of those buyers decided to step out and not participate in that market, no one would notice. One single buyer can't influence market prices. Or on the flip side of that, it's the assumption that we have so many sellers that if one single seller decided they wanted to step out of the market, no one would notice. Buyers have so many other alternatives, they wouldn't even notice it. Another way to think about this, we can think about in terms of gasoline and how well the gas market fits this assumption. The way to think about this is if you were a buyer, if you were one of the many buyers, and you tried to negotiate for more favorable prices, would you have any ability to do that? Would you as a buyer be able to walk into a gas station and say, nah, I don't really want to pay that $2.50 that you've got posted. How about I only pay you $1.50? You would never be able to get away with it. You as an individual buyer have no ability to influence market prices. Why? Because producers have a whole bunch of buyers that they can choose from. That's the assumption, and again, it operates on both sides of the market. Another major assumption we want to talk about is homogeneous product, or sometimes this one's referred to as no product differentiation. We've got to make sure we know what product differentiation is. It has 2 parts to it. Number 1, product differentiation is that consumers believe or perceive that there is a difference between goods. And number 2, consumers are willing to put money down on that perceived difference. So one of the big ways that we can think about that is, oh gosh, I love all these, thinking about generic versus brand name cereal. That's product differentiation. Whenever we have the brand name of something and it costs more and consumers are still willing to pay that higher price for that brand name, that perceived increase, that's what product differentiation is. Product differentiation can either be based on a false perception of a difference in products, or it can be based on a true difference in products. Right? So sometimes there is a real difference between products, and the higher quality product justifiably commands a higher price. Sometimes there's no difference between Reese's Puffs and Cocoa Peanut Butter Spheres. No difference between those two, but consumers perceive this brand name to have a higher quality, and thus that company is able to charge prices that are higher. That's what product differentiation is. A third assumption that we want to make is that there are no or low barriers to entry. This is a pretty innocuous one, but it's basically just saying that, hey, any producer at any point can jump into the market, or at least they have very little difficulty jumping into the market, that there's not a whole lot that's going to make it difficult for a new company to open up operations and start competing. And our last assumption that we want to talk about, all decision makers have perfect information. This is an assumption that I love in part because it's so ridiculous. What we're assuming is that everyone on both sides of the transaction have a tremendous amount of information about what's going on. If we think about buyers, we think about buyers under this assumption as they know exactly what the price of all the products are. Think about that for a second, how unrealistic that is. If I ask you right now, how much does laundry detergent cost? Do you know offhand? Because in our model, we make the assumption that you automatically as a consumer know all of the prices. In addition to that, you know exactly when any of the prices change. Very, very, very high standards. But we're making an assumption that buyers are fully informed about market prices. And on the other side, sellers also have really, really, really good, not just good, but perfect information, right? So we're assuming that sellers know exactly what their cost structure is going to be for a given level of production. If GM wants to produce 40,000 cars, they know exactly down to the dollar how much each of those cars will cost. Totally unrealistic assumption, but it's useful. What else does GM know under this assumption about perfect information? We assume that they perfectly know the prices that they and all of their competitors are charging. So they have full information about their prices and their competitors. Consumers have full information about all the relevant prices that are out there. Gosh, it's just this assumption about knowledge of the market that really doesn't exist in real life. But we're going to assume that it's true, bringing us back to this idea of what the heck is an assumption. All of these things are assumptions that we are making. An assumption is simply a hypothetical statement of what if. We're saying, what if these things were true? What if we lived in a world that operated under these 4 hypothetical what if conditions? What if we had so many buyers, so many sellers in a market that no single buyer or seller was able to influence anything? What if we were considering a market where consumers did not view any differences between products from 2 different producers? What if we were in a market where any producer could open up and start competing at any moment? And what if we had a market where consumers were perfectly informed about all prices and knew the instant that any of the prices were different between any of the other producers? An assumption is not a statement of truth. It's not what we think should be. It's not what we think is. It's not based on fact always. It's simply a hypothetical what-if proposition. All of these assumptions, many of them are totally incorrect. And I hope that you've been thinking about things like gasoline and cars and other things that you buy and how unrealistic these 4 assumptions are for those models. They may not match the way the real world operates, but they're still a useful starting point for us to understand how markets operate. That's what assumptions do for us.